Welcome.
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 Welcome
To celebrate.
To celebrate.
Polly.
Welcome to Celebrate Story.
With my mom.
My mom.
It's my mom.
With my mom.
With my wife.
Julie Wagner.
Julie Wagner.
Julie Wagner.
Julie Wagner.
Here we are, part 2 of Love, Loss, and the Church.
Yes.
I have never wanted...
Take 3,000.
Take 3,000. Steve, I've never wanted to talk about something more and never felt so burdened to be equal parts kind and honest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So...
Not trying to hurt anybody here.
No.
Just trying to get some things off our chest, I guess.
Yeah.
And to grow past that.
Yeah, and to be heard.
Yeah.
To be heard. And if by no one else, myself. Because trusting myself enough to say it and to own it is huge. So I'd love to jump right in, talking about the phrase ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss wrote a book called Ambiguous Loss, which I came across a few years ago, sort of at the beginning of this grief of the loss of a church we loved. And I love the phrase ambiguous loss because she talks about how it's, as a culture, we circle around grief of a lost loved one. And we have all these ambiguous losses of a relationship or a church connection or a miscarriage or a job loss. I mean, there's so many ambiguous losses and we do not know what to say to people. And in her book, she really unpacks that this is the source of, this not dealing with this ambiguous loss is the source of so much anxiety and depression and rage. And wow, have I seen that by not dealing with this, because I am fantastic at spiritually bypassing or avoiding or reframing loss because I want to run from sadness.
I think a lot of people do. And I guess in that ambiguous loss, it's the kind of decision or life change that people kind of look at you and say, well, you chose this. You decided to leave that relationship. You decided to get divorced. You decided to leave the job. You decided to, but at the same time, there is in your life, it's change. So it's, I guess the opposite of it is, somebody dies. You're like that had a finite, ending.
Clear. Yeah.
So
there's a clear time for closure because there's a funeral. And I think that's why I have this burning desire to do this. It's like a funeral.
Yeah.
It's like a funeral.
Kind of
a mark.
Grieve it and move forward.
Yes.
To some extent.
And I have only just scratched the surface on grief work, but I've read a lot on grief, and it's we need those markings to mark that loss, and that's part of the healing process. I love that if you're local to Charlotte, and if you have not already seen the UNC Charlotte Gardens, they have a beautiful space for grief in their gardens. There was a shooting on campus there about 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's about right.
And they had the students come together for their grief work and mark on the stones different messages of hope and love and grief. And it's so beautiful. And I really do get a lot of inspiration from entering in to people's grief because it's it makes us, it's more human, and it's to avoid it causes so many problems. So yeah, and I have to also share the KJ Ramsey story. IC Talks is a ministry I've talked about on here before, that it's a ministry that wants to end the stigma against mental health. And they had KJ Ramsey come and speak a few months ago. And shared a beautiful story about a composer that I was not familiar with. I know like so little about classical music, but she shared about the composer Max Richter, who had loved a famous classical song, which if you heard it, I know you've heard it. Who's ever listening, you've heard it. That like it's played on elevators, it's played in amusement parks, it's used on hold music, it's used everywhere. It's like the most recognizable song ever. And it's like this composer, when talking about why he recomposed that song, his words were, "I fell out of love with the song and it was a loss." And when I heard that, I was undone, because that was the most concise way for me to explain my relationship with the church that I'd put roots down at. It's like, I had fallen out of love and it was a loss. And now I have come to a place of remembering the love I had and accepting the loss I had, which has been a lot of work and a lot of facing of that sadness. So we're going to jump in today talking about that loss.
You want to start with kind of why we landed there 17 years ago or whatever it was, 18 years ago?
Yes, that's a perfect place to start. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah. When we moved to Charlotte, we had been in another church for a little while, and then we found this one. I think we talked about that a little bit last episode. But we were in a new town with a young child. We were in that stage of life where you think you know everything. It's kind of a bell curve, I think. You know, you're born, you don't know anything, you learn, and then you hit a point where you're like, I know everything. And then the rest of your life is realizing you didn't really know anything.
Yeah, we were at the height of how clueless. Right. We were clueless to how clueless we were.
Right. But one thing I think we realized was something was missing as far as, I was kind of looking for a mentor type thing. And the church we found, it was kind of the style. There was the
10 date nights with different mentors. Do you remember when we did that?
Right. But it was geared towards younger families and kind of how to do, finances and date nights and parenting and faith and, all the kind of things that we were, I think, ready to learn about. So it fit, and we jumped in pretty quick.
Yes. And it was so, I've never lost that love. I'm eternally grateful for like the structure of support it brought, because since there was no obvious trauma in my background, I would have never even said I had trauma. And I had no idea how much unacknowledged and unrecognized trauma was like driving my pull to like a high control space and sort of my pleasing response. And I'm sure other people could do the same thing and join the same place and not for the same reasons. But I was unaware how much those wounds were driving me to the place of, and I think that's why I would experience like a tension from like mother and father role models as just deeply, deeply like a balm to my soul, because I was unaware of how starving I was for that.
Yeah, and it's really not till recently that we both kind of worked on that. Julie and I think we may have mentioned it last episode, and I think we're going to do an episode kind of talking about it, but we did a full day intensive trauma therapy session where we kind of broke down just things that happened in our life and how they might be affecting us today. And it kind of triggered, we felt like we were having similar fights all the time. And kind of towards the end of the day, it became fairly apparent of how we react to things that happen to our life, and how we react triggers how the other person reacts. And it was just kind of this
it was
circle.
mind-blowing.
But we'll get into that in more depth.
Yeah, because it really, we have to do an episode on that, because it really is so universal to everyone. As I've shared with close friends in person, it's like our trauma, once it gets touched, We think it's about the schedule, but it's actually about this unresolved trauma.
Yeah. And as a guy, I think I mentioned doing this to a friend of mine and doing the full day trauma thing. And the response was, it was similar to something you would hear, I think, from a lot of guys is, why would I want to think about something that I'm not even thinking about? Why am I going back into my childhood on something that I don't give a lot of thought to now? And I think through research and through therapy and through just kind of reading and getting in tune with it, that whether you're thinking about it or not, the way you're acting and reacting is a lot of it's based on those however many years of life. That first 5 to 10 years, things are happening and that are in your subconscious, and you're responding to, and you don't realize it.
And it's not so much for me, the light bulb it wasn't so much the wounds that happened, it was the internal response and conclusions that you built that just aren't true. Because a lot of times we run on deep truths that never go past that intellectual sphere. And so it's just driving us. It's like our past unhealed places are in the driver's seat of our current selves. And it's, man, we're just mysteries sometimes. And it helped for me see less of a mystery and see more of a connection, and to be more aware of what I'm responsible for in terms of that healing.
So back into the context of church, I think we picked this church and got involved so heavily based on responses from our childhood.
Totally.
We're
perfectly clear now. Was not clear then.
Right. Which led to in this breakup that we've had of the church, we recognize
I love that you say breakup.
We recognize our culpability in it, that we probably placed the leaders of the church in a position that they didn't really
that was
accept.
So unfair. It was so unfair. And sadly, though, the structure, on one hand, it's on our responsibility to not put them in an inappropriate place emotionally. But on the flip side, the structure of most churches is set up for this.
It's maybe too far, but to somewhat take advantage of that.
Yes.
I think.
Well, that assumes intention. And I don't know if churches are trauma informed. Like our churches, how many churches are trauma informed that realizing, okay, this person, like I think about when I ran the volunteer teams I ran, like these people aren't coming back week in and week out, oftentimes for the reasons you think, but that humans have like this fawning response from trauma when it's unhealed. And so you just don't know why.
So people getting positive feedback.
Yeah.
Running a 4-year-old room from a leader.
Yes. For me, I probably spoke too generally just a moment ago, but yeah, like for me, that was not about, and though I think it's so messy because there's a lot of good that came out of that. I learned about myself and I'm so grateful they trusted me and I learned so much doing it. But on the flip side, that wasn't moving me towards a healing space or a knowing of myself space. And it's like a great knowing of self is a great knowing of God. A great knowing of God is a great knowing of self. I love that quote. It's like, do we really know why we're doing what we're doing? And it's like, none of us are going to want to change it until it's painful. And it became very painful to deal with the loss of why the church no longer fit. But I kind of went off on a side tangent.
No, but I think that's a good segue into why didn't it fit? Ultimately, why did we leave?
Ultimately, it was such a slow decision for me. I feel like you have to go first because I've been working on making this concise for a year.
Well, why don't we go back and forth?
Okay.
So I'll go with my first one.
Okay.
I think an ultimate reason was, and I've said this to a few people, we became members of the church a couple years after we started. And I have the belief that the church that we joined was not the same church that we left. Mm-hmm. That there were a lot of changes, and all organizations go through change.
Right.
So there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I see a church as a community, and I don't think the community that existed at an older time in this church was really consulted on the direction that it was headed. And that rubbed me the wrong way, that it was lots of changes being made. I became a member of the church because I wanted to be a member of the community, but there was no input into where the church was headed. And the direction of the church tended to lean towards the vision of one person.
Mm-hmm.
So what I thought I was joining and what it felt like more of when we joined was a community, and in the end seemed more like a business organization with a strong CEO.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's the prerogative of the church. It's the prerogative of any organization to do that, but it kind of gives me, even though joining a church, I think, is something you shouldn't take lightly. So leaving the church shouldn't be taken lightly either. But it kind of helped to think about it in that context of, we left a different church than we joined, and we didn't have a say in it getting to where it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think what's really hard about leaving this church in particular is that there's a strong continual message of, it's not about you, it's not about you. And there's a strong message of, you're selfish for leaving. And I have asked for forgiveness from the folks I have carried that message to when they left. Because, I mean, for the 15 years we were there and it was a good fit, every few years, a close friend or three would leave, because it's a place that people would leave after a few years with lots of regularity. It wasn't surprising. It's not a place that has deep, deep roots, except for a very small amount of people. And
some of that is Charlotte's transient nature.
That's true.
Like, people physically moved.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
But people were also just leaving the church to go to different churches.
Yes, but it makes me think of like when my best friend from middle school moved to Charlotte. I was trying to get her to go to this church because we went there. And she was like, oh, well, I found out at my Bunko group, that's a beginner church, that people don't stay there long. And at the time I was working at the church, I was like, no. But I understand what the word on the streets was. It is a place that people will stay a few years and then move to something else. And I took on this responsibility that I now realize was never mine to take on, that it's like, okay, I see people leave because there's a lack of community. I will just do everything in my power to build and nurture community in my sphere. And it's like, I took on this, like, I literally at times quit some of the paid jobs to more fully like engross myself in this job. And I'd do it all over again. And I'm grateful for the pain of like when that blew up and I realized I took this on and it didn't have the support of the structure of the church, and that I was expendable in that. And that to me showed like, okay, sometimes the church ideals and the business ideals, they clash. And in my experience, the business ideals trumped. And that was heartbreaking for me, because I interacted with these roles I took on with a church mindset. And I was always craving more community was possible. And as I pulled away to heal, because it no longer was a safe space for me, it was a very painful place to go into. And I was healing. It was like I found community everywhere outside of the church walls. And I thought, why was I limiting this? Because I no longer think this way, but I used to see like working at the church as like the godliest thing. And like volunteering on the weekends was like the best thing, because that was like saving people. But as I unraveled, I think God's work is much bigger than like what's happening on an hour on a Sunday. But I really did make that everything. Like I really idolized it. And now through a lot of healing, and I still have way more to do. It's like there's a quote by Julian of Norwich that the fullness of joy is finding God everywhere and in everything. You nick the surface of anything and you will find the face of God. I find this to be true again and again and again. I have found community in my neighborhood like I was always longing for and hustling for at church. And so that was as concise as I can make it, Steve, but it's like there was pain and stress when I would go that I tried everything in my power to fix, and I couldn't fix it.
It just wasn't the right place anymore.
It just wasn't, it just wasn't the right place anymore. It wasn't the place I thought it was. And there weren't relationships that they weren't what I thought they were. They weren't the relationships I thought they were. They were.
Well, I think I can jump into kind of my second, not that I've labeled or numbered these, but you had mentioned your friend saying it was a beginner church, or
yeah,
like a starter church. And I can see where it gets that reputation, because when we first started, the messages were very applicable to us. Like it fit. Like it was parenting, it was how to do life, how to do marriage, how to do faith, how to mix it all in together. It very much fit. Through the years, we heard the same message over and over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. It was predictable. We could finish sentences like it was, which that's fine. That's a style, and that's it. As a pastor who has been a pastor for 20 something years, like coming up with new stuff every weekend is probably
so hard.
Yeah, it's not feasible.
And he's a fantastic teacher, so a lot of these messages were so awesome to hear again and again.
Yeah. But at a point, we had it. Like we understood what was being said and what was going to be said and what it meant and how to apply it or not apply it. So after hearing it, then it started to hit that, going into certain situations and doing, it's not always do A, B, and C, and you're going to get X result.
Yeah.
And it's going to be great. This is how I did it. You should do it this way too. And life will be great. And you'll be closer to God and your family. And it just, when you actually get into life, you realize that A, B, and C may also have D, E, F, G, H, I, J,
Infinite.
K. And
infinite letters.
It doesn't always equal to X.
No.
It could equal to jail.
And I think I love that you brought that up, because then there became like a hunger as like, I would say our late 30s. There's like this hunger of like, life is complex. We're complex. Family is complex. We've memorized all these things. We want those to be the true answers, but we are starving for community spaces to explore the gray, to explore okay, A, B, and C did not get me. The results that I have memorized would get me. And it's like, that started really being a weight and a burden of like, okay, this is incomplete. And this is just like a surface, which of course a message can only be a surface, but it's like there weren't community structures to really unpack those things, because things are always changing at that place, which is awesome. I salute change. That sounds funny. What I'm saying is I'm not trying to throw stones at change. I'm saying we desperately needed, with our growing family, we desperately needed places of community to explore the nuances and the complexities and the griefs and the mysteries of life. And we could not find it, especially because at that point, it didn't feel safe anymore. And I couldn't do anything else to fix that. So that was hard.
Some of that is that it wasn't very... The church is what's called a seeker-targeted church. So they're looking for the least and the lost, which I'll get to in a minute. But the Sunday messages are on purpose meant to be not that deep, I guess, because they're expecting the person that's sitting there that day to have never walked in a church before or have very, very limited knowledge of a church. And that's kind of who their target was. But we ended up wanting something a bit deeper, which is us. Again,
Right.
that's a style.
And
But
even
when
as
when it came to moments where conflict arose, which happens in any relationship and
any family, any community, it happens.
we also found that they didn't want conflict. That it was not necessarily it wasn't dealt with. They tried to just put a happy face on it and kind of push it off to the side.
Mhm.
And
And we desperately needed help with that.
it was a real conflict.
I did. It was painful.
It was not a little thing. It was a big thing, and it involved people who were really involved in the church.
Yeah, and even as you say that, I started to interrupt, and I'm glad that you kept talking. It's like I just have this gut feeling when it's like we needed something deeper. I can hear the training of being there 15 years. Well, it's not about you. But what I've realized, it's about all of us. And I no longer even believe that any of us could imagine who's far from Christ or who's close to Christ, because I have experienced such intense love and grace and beauty from the people that previously, when I was active in church, would have been labeled as lost. And so it's like now I see it as quite arrogant to think I would be close just because I've said some magic prayer and my butt has sat in a seat and volunteered in a preschool classroom and worked at church. Like that feels so startling to me. I heard a quote once that like, Christ has many the church doesn't have, and the church has many Christ doesn't have. So I no longer, at that point, I no longer bought into this idea of evangelizing a place. I fall with the Mother Teresa idea of the only evangelizing I'll do will be on love.
We talked about this in my men's group Friday. We're reading Tattoos on the Heart by Gregory Boyle. And there was a point where he talked about, and he put it in quotes, and he kind of made fun of not made fun of himself, but just kind of rolled his eyes at himself, I guess is the best, where he talked about saving people. And the book, very briefly, he's a Catholic priest in Los Angeles. He works with gang members. He started different industries called Homeboy Industries that do
the largest gang rehabilitation program in the country.
Yes. So thousands and thousands and thousands of gang members have come through and had jobs and got tattoos removed and, all kinds of stuff to try and point them into a different direction, to give them a sense that there's something else besides being a gang member and dealing drugs and doing whatever. But the book is, it kind of flips the saving message around, that I'm sure he does. I'm sure he's human, but he tries to portray that he's not better than anybody. Mm-hmm. He's doing this. He's created this organization. He's a Catholic. He's a priest. He's, people really look up to him, but he goes out of his way through the book to show how much he's learned and grown and seen God through the people that are out doing the dealing of drugs and the killings and the
it's all inspiring
that they're saving him is just as much as any of him saving, and I do this thing in air quotes, saving them.
Yes, it's exquisitely mutual is what he says in his book Barking to the Choir, and that moves me so deeply, and that's a faith that I want to tend and nurture, because for me, what I experienced and what I'm leaving from church is this like pyramidal structure where one person or one team of people are serving these other people. And to me, the very presence of Christ shows up when it's exquisitely mutual. There's no power structure. And I've gotten to the point where, and that feels safer to me if everyone has power. And I know that's simply said and like, okay, well, how does that actually play out? And I think that's where I have a real struggle with we've been to how many churches now that we've visited? It's like, what are we looking for? But I really struggle if there's like an imbalance of power, because when push comes to shove, like I want everyone to be heard and everybody to have a place at the table.
Yeah. And I think when that message comes out as it's not about you, it's about the church or it's about God or but you look at the structure of the organization that you're in and you're like, but it really seems to be about you. Like,
Yes.
you're making all the decisions and I don't necessarily want to go this, but your family's in places of leadership and the staff is treated differently than the congregation. It really begins to be this you and them.
Mm-hmm. There's an us versus them. And that is a grief that I still need healing on, because it's like I worked so hard and wanted to build this homeschool community so badly. And that wasn't something that was funded or blessed. But now there's a need, because some of the family that runs the church, they have kids of a school age. And so now from outside perspective, it appears like this bursting, full of life community where things that were previously cut, like Christmas musicals, are now like there. And so it's like that's a great grief. That's hard for me. And I'm not afraid to show that wound. It's hard for me to see, and it's not that I don't want them to have it. I want them to have it, but it's so sad to me that it's not for the whole community to have a Christmas musical, or the whole community to have a school for their preschoolers. So that's a tough one for me that I'm still working on just facing.
I think it really comes into focus when you hear, well, it's not about you.
Yeah, because it's like, oh, I know it's not about me. That's why I absolutely want to serve. And so now it just feels safer to pour my volunteer time in my community with being a cheer coach and a swim director and gathering women in my neighborhood. It just feels a safer space. Will that be perfectly never without problems? No, there's been problems, but it doesn't feel like the business goals and the church goals are going to be at such a tension. It feels more clear of what we're dealing with. And I think that's where I long to find a place that I can trust, because I think, once you're wounded, you go in and you're like, okay, now I'm just going to assume that this is like a business. This is run like a business. I don't want to not assume that, which is fair. That's a fair choice for, in America, a business to make. But it's a choice that I have seen hurts many, many, many people.
So I think that's a good place for us to segue into the last piece of this, is to say, what are we looking for? We've been to a dozen churches since we've kind of started this journey, and we're not really landing anywhere. So what are we looking for? You want to start?
Yes. And I have to say, there's a part of me that it's like, yeah, I haven't landed everywhere, but I've also landed everywhere. Because there's another quote that I love. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but it moves me and I love it. So I have to share it. It is the madness of great love to see God in everything. And so it's like, yeah, I haven't put roots down at a church. But it's like, I think about the beginning of December, at the beginning of Advent, we visited a church that one wasn't the right fit for us. But in the back of the church, it probably was only a 7-minute conversation with a woman in her 70s, but time stopped. It was church for me that day. She was adoring my son Boaz, who didn't want to go into the nursery, which that was new too, because it coming from a church that you couldn't have children in the service with you. But right now, Boaz is just a child we want in the service with us. That's what we need as a family. And she adored him and just absolutely looked at him with eyes of awe and eyes of love. And I just ended up getting in this conversation with her. And I actually ended up finding out that she lost 2 sons herself. And we just had this moment of pure silence, looking eye to eye, tears coming down my face. And it was precious to me to be able to sit with her in her presence. And how does this woman have all this pain, had all this loss, and yet here she is adoring my son? This woman has done some work with her grief. And so I asked her, I said, what have you done with your grief? And she said, I've painted and I've painted and I've painted, and I've put all my sadness on so many canvases. She said, it's still there, but I have a place to put it. This conversation was a gift to me. This conversation was church to me. And it was like, that is my work right now, is to continue to find a place a healthy place to put my grief. And that to me is what I'm looking for, is to find a church that there's spaces for grief, because the older we get, there will be more grief. And I want a space to put it. I want a space that celebrates the grief and the big, huge celebrations, because they're all a part of being human. And so that is one thing that's really important. And I find even church in my neighborhood, like, I don't know, I have this like really cool situation where there's 4 families on our street, and we're all connected by a text thread, and our kids always hop from backyard to backyard out of all 4 yards. They go from like the trampoline at one person's yard to like the ninja slackline in our yard. And the kids, when off of school, are frequently just bouncing from house to house, getting popcorn at one house, juice from another. And there's frequent texts of like, have you found Ezra's shoes? I think you left them at your house, and all this stuff. But you know what my favorite part is probably 3 or 4 times a week, I either ask or I ask to give or I'm sorry, I ask to receive, or am giving like extra virgin olive oil or a cup of flour or a Gatorade drink for a sick child, or ibuprofen. It's just, or does anybody have mint? Like whatever it is that like we all could go run to the grocery store. Every single one of us are just minutes from the grocery store. And the other week I was walking back with some extra virgin olive oil after a particularly long and tiring and discouraging day. And I like almost wept. And I'm like, why am I crying over a cup of extra virgin olive oil? And I'm like, it's not about the virgin olive oil. It's like, this feels like church to me. This is love. It's practical. It's tangible. They are right here. And it's not about that. It's like, go buy the virgin olive oil, but it's like a reminder that I am connected and I'm supported and that I'm not alone. And that to me, moments like that, I could do a whole season of podcasts on moments like that, because those are so moving to me. And those are the church to me. And they were what I was always looking for at our previous church. And I also am finding hope in just finding community projects like the Sun Project. I'm going to get to be able to tell some stories for the Sun Project. And I am so excited to celebrate mothers who've overcome drug addictions. That there'll be more details to come, but I'm going to do some podcasts recording their stories. And that feels like such an honor. It feels such an honor to be able to stand in awe of what they have done.
So I guess to summarize what we're looking for in that direction in a church is a community that I think it's our responsibility to get in community with people, but I think a church that models healthy community and deep community is what we're looking for.
Yes, and maybe I'll just always find that, I feel torn, because maybe I'll always just find that like in my neighborhood. Maybe not. Maybe that'll dry up tomorrow. But I guess I see community as more of this larger source of love that comes through people and the places that shifts, but that like the love is always there. And I do still long for like a liturgy and a rhythm of a place we can go that can like help us with our kids, help us show our kids right from wrong and truth from lies. And I mean that in a very broad sense. I don't mean that in a very, and I think that's where I struggle, because it's like I was in this super small conservative Christian bubble, and it's like, truth is broader and more hotly debated. So it's like, how do you find a place when you're acknowledging that truth is broader and more hotly debated than you previously accepted? And of course, I want to find a place I can give my talents and passions, because that is a big part of the grief too. Like I miss having a place, a community that I can give to in so many different ways. And I miss that deeply. And it's funny because there's like, I'm always like in my mind scanning how someone would judge something I said. And the fact that's like, I want a place that'll help me raise my kids, not help me raise them, but like a community, help me show them right from wrong. And it's like, I can just hear that voice again. It's not about you. Don't be selfish. But it's like the work for me, if you've ever done any Enneagram work, an Enneagram 2's work is to like show up to the table with needs. It is tremendous growth and maturity for me to be like, I have needs and this is what I want. Because as far as giving goes, like I'm going to do that. It's just, it's who I am and it's what I do. But to show up looking for something more reciprocal, looking for more reciprocity. So
let me add something to that as far as giving, financially also. I want a place that I feel comfortable giving our financial tithes and offerings to.
Yeah.
That has transparency. Because that's something that was lacking, that I know I have a good understanding of where the money's going when we give it to the church and what they're spending on, and just kind of the direction that is taking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the last thing I'm looking for, I'm sure there's more, but the top one that comes to me is a place that is okay with uncertainty, that is okay with saying, I don't know, that speaks from the pulpit, whoever's speaking, kind of comes with the era of, this is kind of what I'm thinking, or this is the best that I understand what I read, or something like that, versus this is what the Bible says, or this is what God thinks, or this, I'm looking for, because we did a podcast on certainty, so you can go back and find that in the archives, but that's kind of where we're coming from, that we're looking for a place where it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yes. And I love that you brought that up. I would have been so sad if we wrapped up with these poems and didn't say that, because I really want to grow in intellectual humility. And I think about the fact that like so many churches, are like, this is the meaning of Jesus dying on the cross. And then you find out there's 7 theories of atonement. What? So a group of people have picked one and it's like, this is the meaning. Like, this is a pretty key part. Like, we teach kids memorize things about this, but there's theories. And I don't know. I think that can make us a more united people if we really own the areas that are theories that we're teaching as facts in theology, because we all think we're so right because it's wrapped up into our faith, and that divides us. And so I'm looking for a place that I can grow in intellectual humility because that's modeled, and that I can grow in unity because that's modeled. That's so important. Yes, so much. All the good stuff of the 40s is like, for me, grief, mystery, humility, like so much growth for me happens in those places.
Yeah, well, built into faith is uncertainty, I think.
Yes.
That if you're sure of something, you don't have to have faith.
Right.
Because you know it's true.
Yes.
So you can only have faith in things that you don't know is true, because you need that. I don't know.
Yes, and
it's kind of a circular thing in my head.
It makes room for honesty, because I think in my experience of Christian circles, we so badly want community. Sometimes I, and people that I've had the gift of hearing their heart, it's like there becomes a dissonance between like what we are told was the way and our experience, like, and having some intellectual humility and spiritual humility makes room for, just because we've picked one side doesn't automatically make the right one. It's just the one we're holding loosely at the time.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to quote, I have 2 quotes. First one, it was written at the beginning of the pandemic by a Franciscan theologian named Ilia Delio. And he reminds us that we can celebrate the risen Christ everywhere. Here it is. Where is this risen Christ? Everywhere and all around us. In you, your neighbor, the dogwood tree outside, the budding grapevine, the ants popping up through the cracks. The whole world is filled with God, who is shining through even the darkest places of our lives. To go to church is to awaken to this divine presence in our midst and respond in love with a yes. Your life, oh God, is my life and the life of the planet. Wow. Every time I read that, it's so moving, because it's like, yes, we live in a Christ-soaked world. He is everywhere. And for so long, I saw just what was happening in those 4 walls as everything. I would have denied that but that was like deeply where I put my energy. And the last poem I want to end with, because I read this from Diana Butler Bass. She is a historian. And I've just been enjoying like getting to know her through her books and her blog and some different teachings she has done. And this she has included in one of her talks, and it's by the mystical poet Ibn Arabi. There was a time I would reject those who were not my faith, but now my heart has grown capable of taking on all forms. It is a pasture for gazelles, an abbey for monks, a table for the Torah, Kaaba for the pilgrim. My religion is love. Whichever the route love's caravan shall take, that shall be the path of my faith.
Let's keep